Hello, everybody. Welcome to all our listeners and viewers to the Restricted Hand podcast. Unfortunately, I'm here today alone without my trusted partner, Ryan. But fortunately, I'm here in Kyiv on location where I've been for a week, and I'm here with a very special guest. And I want to say to our guest, Phil, who's a commander in the 3rd Corps, and who I had the pleasure of meeting a couple of months ago in another location, which we will not discuss. Здоров'я бажаємо. І ласкаво просимо до подкаста Restricted Handling. Phil, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. For our listeners, just so everyone knows, we started to do the podcast. We went through about 20 minutes and then we had a power outage. So we're starting from scratch, but that's better because I get to spend more time talking to Phil.
That's quite important, I believe, for your listeners to hear what we are going to talk.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background? Where were you before 24 February 2022 when Russia expanded its invasion of your country?
I'm IT professional for 20 years, working for banking, for finance, for telecom. The year and basically right before the war, I was a CTO in some software development company at Cyprus and just came back just before the war.
Just before the war. Did you suspect that the Russians were going to expand their invasion when you returned?
Yeah, at that point, it was already obvious that something is going to happen. That was clear. Since you were in Russia, in Moscow, I believe you saw this level of propaganda is rising. You know, when you have steam in the pot boiling, so it should go somewhere.
Phil, my podcast partner and friend, Ryan, always starts the podcast by welcoming all the freedom-loving people, which I think in Ukrainian say, vololubny narodi. I always say whenever we have a Ukrainian guest on the podcast, and we've been fortunate to have a few now, and your example it characterizes this spirit of freedom. And your example to all people around the world to come back to defend your country from an aggressor that wants to take away your sovereignty and your independence. It's inspiring. So just thank you for that inspiration. That's, people always ask me, why do I keep coming back to Ukraine? And I keep telling them because every time I come here, I'm inspired by the stories I hear, by the people I meet. And so thank you for that. And I hope our listeners at home and our viewers at home understand that and recognize this. Ryan wanted me to ask you a question. You were just in Davos for the Davos Summit. How long were you there? And can I ask what you were doing there? And then what your impression was of the meetings you had, and whether our European partners and maybe the Americans you met understand the challenges Ukraine is going through and what needs to happen to stop this war.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, last week I was in Davos, and normally Davos is happening three active days, and fourth is a closure. So we were there from very beginning to the end of active sessions. Have a lot of meetings with security advisors, with ministers of defense of different countries, mainly European. And our mission there was exactly to bring them like direct description of what's going on, tell them what's happening from the ground, from front line, and also quite important, listen to them. What is their vision, opinion, what's happening inside of European nations, societies, and politicians.
And your impression, do you think that Europeans understand how important your success in this war is for Europe, given that Ukraine is probably, we can say, the future of Europe, in my opinion?
The overall impression is that united Europe is not so united. It's still quite different nations with different thoughts on the future of the Europe, on the thoughts on Ukraine, on Russia. We all know Hungary and some other countries which still believe they can actually deal with Russia and so on. However, there are different countries, especially on the north, especially Britain. They recognize what's going on quite well. Actually, we already have established relations with them. They support Ukraine, support Ukrainian army quite massively. And in exchange, we are giving them and teaching them to what modern warfare is. because they recognize this threat from coming from Russia. The best thing, they understand that it's not about territory of Ukraine, which is absolutely misleading talks. Everyone can see Russia on the map, can Google population of Russia and ensure that there are a lot of space still, and it's not about get some additional land. Absolutely not. The whole this discussion right now about Donbass or some territories or Slavyansk or Kramatorsk, it's some hundred of thousand square kilometers. This is certainly not the point for the discussion, and not the reason for aggression. To lose up to 1 million people already for a couple of square kilometers, probably there is some other reason for that.
What is your assessment? What is the reason? What is driving Putin and the regime in Moscow to pursue this horrible war?
West is still consider Russia as rational in their thinking, but it is not. It looks like they are driven completely by other irrational thinking, and they want to build a neo empire, and this neo empire is actually what they are trying to implement. And it's absolutely in different ways. Syria have Russia involved, in Georgia, in many conflicts. Also in some South American countries, there was an attempt. That everything from the same chain of thoughts, that they really want to restore Soviet Union, Great Russia, or whatever, and they see themselves as a great someone want to sit on the table together with United States, with China, and split the world in part. That's basically what they are trying to do.
Right. And going back to your career after you came into the armed forces and started your service, what is your current position now? And how can you describe the situation? Because I know that you're, by the way, for our listeners, our viewers, Phil is not doing podcasts all the time. He's actually fighting a war. And last time I met him, we were much closer to the front. We were with some of his colleagues, and I saw what they're doing, which is pretty impressive. But can you just describe a little bit of what you're doing and what the situation now militarily is along the front?
Yeah. I'm Chief Unmanned Systems Officer of Third Army Corps. Third Army Corps right now handles more than 150 kilometers of front line. It's more than 12% of the whole front line of Ukraine. And I'm basically responsible for UAVs, for UGVs, any innovative technologies related to drones and units who's using that. Yeah, I came just yesterday to to visit you, to have another meeting, and I will go back tomorrow. So military situation on the ground is changing, and this is how dynamic the modern warfare is. Actually, it changed every half a year. We have quite significant change in tactics, in technology, in everything, and that's that biggest challenge for traditional armies and traditionally military technology sector. So right now, after being able to completely block any possibility for mechanized assaults from Russia side by using drones, basically, and we destroy most of their potential in number of tanks, in number of armored vehicles and APCs and of that kind. So they switch their tactics to infiltration, because they still have man resource as the cheapest they can get. So they are not limited by number of people yet. And so they change their tactics to a small group trying to get in between of our positions as far as deep as they can. And by doing so, they try to interfere our logistics, try to block possibility for our pilots to use drones. And by that means, they try to push push a front line deeper to our territory. They were having more significant success during previous year, but right now the front is more or less stable because we also adapt to these tactics, and it's not so successful anymore. And the last change in Russia's what they're doing, they just switch to more to propaganda and fakes directed more to Western audience rather than what's happening on the ground. So this is what you can notice, and your listeners probably know this fake captures of villages and towns around Ukraine, which is pretty far from reality. Just give you one example. During last week, Russia's recorded for their commandment and probably to mass media their success to capture some village pretty deep inside our territory, which we control pretty stable. But we identified that, and ASEAN community confirmed that this recording was made 40 kilometers from the point they claimed.
40 kilometers on the other side.
On the other
the
side.
other side, and they claimed.
Deep inside their back, yeah.
Yeah. So on the topic of propaganda and the covert influence operations that the Russians have been running, going back to Europe, how do you see that playing out in Europe and in the U.S.? And I also would be remiss not to ask you, how do you see U.S. support for Ukraine now, and how does some of the change in U.S. policy impact the morale of your troops along the front line?
Yeah, we have these waves in support from U.S. From the very beginning of the war till this time, and sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. It's not a secret that everyone's supposed to have much larger technical support and maybe some response from NATO in order to, and from Europe as well, as a reaction to absolutely unbelievable large-scale war in the center of Europe that should not even happen. And if it happens, then it must be stopped immediately. But since that time, it happened what happened, and actually we also adapting to these waves from US side. I mean, we had seen the situation when all support was stopped. We have seen situation when we have plenty of weapon getting from US. Of course, we are very thankful for everything what we got, but we are continue our fight despite any either we get some support or not, because basically we have no choice in our fight.
Right. But on the issue of propaganda and kind of where this war is being waged, and we talked a little bit about this during our break off camera, it's just important, in my opinion, and I'm just going to share my assessment with our viewers. This war is not just being waged against Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting the war on behalf of the collective West and in U.S. interest to try and stop a very aggressive regime from forcing its will, not just on Ukraine, but on other countries, which including, unfortunately, would be the U.S. in the future, in my opinion, which is something Americans need to remember.
The first thing is to percept Putin is not a democratic president. It's first of all product of KGB, and this is how he see the whole the world. This war was starting not as military operation. It was rather a special operation in terms of KGB. There was more bet on psychology, on that kind of thing, and that's basically on propaganda again. To overtake Ukraine was a step to show the power, but to show not to Ukrainians, but rather to West. As we discussed, he's building his neo-empire, and that this neo-empire in his mind should also take some parts of former Soviet Union, as well as Warsaw Pact, which is also covers some Eastern European countries that are part of currently of European Union. The methods Putin is using is more special services. So what we can see and what you need to understand that he's trying to spark the conflict whenever he can inside. And we clearly can see this smoke coming from different corners of the world, and support any radical forces that could be, despite it's left or right or whatever, green or blue, doesn't really matter. It's about to use their amplitude to shake the system. So that's probably the most important message I want to give you. So just perceive this, what's happening and what you hear from Russia, just in that way.
Yeah. Thank you for that message, and I agree with you. And it's very important for people to understand that. Part of that, like one aspect of this is we've discussed that the Russians have had limited or almost no success on the front line in taking more territory. Other than their infiltration of small teams and their propaganda efforts, Putin is not achieving much. We heard this week from people that the Russians lost maybe 30,000 troops in 1 month in January, 35,000 in casualties in December. So they're paying a huge price for taking very small, incremental, small pieces of land. And so my own assessment is, and I welcome your thoughts on this, but they've doubled down on their efforts to terrorize the Ukrainian people by targeting your infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, critical infrastructure throughout the country. We're here in Kyiv, and it's beautifully covered in snow, but there are many people here that are living, and not just in Kyiv, but around the country, without heat in their apartments during a very, very cold winter. Again, I want our listeners and followers to understand that the conditions here are very, very difficult for people. My assessment is that Putin is doing this again this year to try and terrorize the Ukrainian people into submission. And yet what I'm seeing is that it's actually having the opposite effect. People are very, very resilient. I will say we started doing the podcast and then we had a blackout because of an electricity cut. And nobody in the studio here seemed very upset. Everybody laughed about it and was ready to get back to work, which is the resilience of the Ukrainian people, which is stunning. It's amazing. But from your perspective, one, do you think that Putin's trying to terrorize your country by targeting your energy infrastructure? And two, how do you see the Ukrainian people responding to this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. On the ground, there's no much advances, especially during last probably half a year. Even in our core, destroy near 1,000 Russian people a week. A week. Because of this quite, expensive infiltration tactics, they're simply losing, like hundreds of them died. No evacuation is possible. These small groups are moving by foot for 40 kilometers and being killed by drones with a chance of 90%. It's something unbelievable.
So just to clarify, 40 kilometers from the front line is where they have to be deployed by vehicle.
Yeah, we, as I told you, we completely stopped logistics, like massive logistics on that side. For 20 kilometers is closed quite well. It's not possible to use APCs or any trucks within these zones. These small groups are going by foot for 40 kilometers before being either killed or captured. So yeah, that's situation on the ground. And it looks like they don't have much opportunity to somehow change this, because we also find our contraction for these tactics, and it works pretty fine. And yes, you're absolutely right. So Putin just switched to pure terrorism since he cannot reach his goals on a battlefield. So he switched to just uncovered terrorism of civilians and civilian infrastructure. The strikes on energy sector, on heating plants during pretty cold winter. I believe this is the coldest winter for quite long. This week's it was -20 in Kyiv and through the whole Ukraine. Being without electricity, without heat for civilian society is not so easy task even to physically to survive. But again, I believe there is a great miscalculation from Putin that people start somehow to put pressure on government, on president, I believe this is a big surprise for him that there is no such actions. And what he cannot understand is that this is not about just surrender. This is about survival for Ukrainians. We have seen what happened to Eastern Ukraine, which he's supposed to free from Ukraine, but there's no man over there. All of them was sent to the front line, and most of them were killed in action. Basically, there is no industry, no infrastructure. It's just unpopulated territory.
This is the Donbass.
Yeah, Donbass.
Yeah, what they've occupied so far.
Yeah, and we saw them in Bucha, we saw them in Kherson, we saw them all over Ukraine. We clearly understand that in case of any kind of surrender, this is what will happen to people living here. And it's not for military men, it's for civilian as well.
Right. And what do you see in terms of the Russian morale? I mean, they're suffering significant battlefield losses. They have been unable to make gains. Their economy is in serious trouble. Everything that we see from your contact with the Russians on the front line, how do you see it impacting their morale?
Yeah, hard to say what happening inside of Russia. This is really good question, and I would also be quite curious to know their opinion, but we will not get even chance to know that because of strict control of mass media and any talks, and basically they're afraid to say something. This is a kind of worst time of Soviet Union that they cannot speak. But on the front line, they also actually there are two categories there. The one is those who came to earn some money, and they basically were promised to have some position somewhere in the back, assisting somehow be on duty on the roads or whatever. But in 2 weeks, they've been sent to as a part of the small groups and being killed or captured without any trainings, without enough equipment, and so on and so on. And another part is those who did something is wrong from their commandment perspective and being forced to move into Azalt. But since they have no choice, no possibility for judgment of any kind, they simply also have no choice other than simply go to our positions and either die or being captured. Also want to notice that we can see that there are many foreigners appears from Russia side. This is absolutely different nations throughout the world.
Yeah, what are you seeing in terms of the foreign fighters on the Russian side?
They're different. Some of them come here for money. Some of them were somehow get to Russia, maybe for work, but being arrested and sent to sent to army. But I would say any foreigners nowadays in Russia is at great risk without any reason they could be captured and sent to frontline. Of course, there are no trainings for them. They have quite poor communication capabilities with translators, simply no support. Of course, no evacuation or of any kind, and basically absolutely no chance.
So this is basically cannon fodder. They're being used as
Absolutely.
cannon fodder. Okay. Well, any of our listeners that are thinking about joining the Russian army, think twice.
Be very careful. Be very careful. There might be even no reason for some crime in Russia, but it cannot be just for the reason you're foreigners.
Shifting gears, Phil, if we can, we just finished the second round of trilateral negotiations in Abu Dhabi. There are some different commentaries coming out. What we heard after the first round was that the Russian delegation had changed. It's now headed by the head of the GRU, that the tone of the discussions was different, that the Russians seemed more serious about talking about actual negotiations and less serious about reading historical lectures, which are based on a version of history which is very, let's just say, untrue and twisted, but that's what they were doing in the past. What is your assessment now on the chances of some kind of peace agreement before the end of the year? And what are the main sticking points from the Ukrainian perspective that need to be overcome? What are the compromises that Russia needs to make to bring this war to an end?
When we talk about negotiation, we assume that there should be a kind of rationale behind this negotiation. I believe our understanding of rational is far different from what Russia actually has. Again, they think about this neo-empire and restoration of Soviet Union and influence and so on. But what we see is this negotiation around Donbass, Donetsk region, Lugansk region, and so on. For Russia, this is just an opportunity to keep negotiating or just not piss off Donald Trump, but rather waste some time not to get some new sanctions and continue what they continue to do. In order to have negotiations, there must be conditions on the front line and in economic. So when they have this negotiation, certainly prolong their economy survival. And for them, this is a kind of other dimension of frontline because of course, economy can't stop. The cost of their missile impact on Ukraine is close to $1 billion each.
$1 billion.
Yeah, and they have to take somehow that from economy.
Right.
So, of course, this is the most painful, I would say, right now for them, is that possibility to stop their fleet and their possibility to export oil and other materials. So from that perspective, they will continue this negotiations around any point that is hard for Ukraine to accept. Ukraine does not trade the territory. It's not possible from neither side. It's Ukrainian people there. It's Ukrainian territory by all international law, and we know that it's also a great fortification line, which right now effectively blocks Russia advances. So for none of Ukrainian politician, I believe, can actually get this territory out. So it's just waste of time.
Right. They're buying time, dragging this out. You think, yeah? What do you think it would take to get Putin to actually make the compromises that would be acceptable for Ukraine to stop the war?
Of course, economy. I believe for two dimensions, basically Russia's economy and people on the ground. We need to reinforce ourselves and completely stop their advances, which is doable with some support, of course. We need to protect our infrastructure, and for that, this is where we certainly need support from US, that our civilian society does not suffer from terrorism, and we need anti-air systems to protect the sky, and probably we need to act symmetrically against Russia with deep strikes as well.
Yeah, there's so many questions and so many things to discuss. We really appreciate your taking the time, knowing how busy you are. I just have one last question for you. What do you want to do when the war's over? What is your one dream? I know you told me you've lived overseas before in a very sunny. What do you and your family want to do?
That was one of the most commonly asked question in Davos. What makes you resilient, and how you not surrender all that time? And I do explain that basically we live in a situation when we simply have no other choice. And for us, and for me especially, it's easier right now to live in reality when we are in war, and we don't think that any day, any nearest day, this would be over, because we already have seen this several times with these peace negotiations, that it's pretty close that tomorrow there would be some peace, the day after tomorrow, or anyhow any close. But actually it has effect, especially on the soldiers, especially on those who are in trenches. No one want to die in the last day of the war,
Right.
And from that perspective, it's better not to think what would be after the war, but to put these efforts for today to stop that war.
Well said. Well said. Again, thank you, Phil, for your time, for what you're doing for your country, for our country, for the world right now, for anybody that believes in the values that I grew up with and many Americans grew up with, the right to self-defense, for your sovereignty, your freedom, your culture. You have a beautiful country. People here are extremely inspiring, impressive. It's just a wonderful place. And I see your point about undermining morale maybe when you talk about peace. But I personally hope this war comes to an end. I think the Russians need to stop this. All the Russians I know, I hope... Я надеюсь, что вы понимаете, эта война, это дурацкая война, это не нужна, и это не помогает ничем, ни вам, ни России. Это только делает хуже. Обманывает вас. Вы, наверное, это знаете. Надо прекращать эту войну. Надо давить на ваше государство и нашего так называемого лидера, чтобы он прекращал эту дурацкую его идиотскую войну. Let the Russian people tell their leadership to stop this war. And I do hope that we are learning the lessons too, that you are sharing with us. And I appreciate that you said you went to Europe. I asked you when we first met, I said, do you think that any military in NATO today is ready to fight this kind of war? And your response was? No.
I believe right now this is also part of our discussion, that European Union should also understand that they already have their European Union army that really can protect them, and there is no one else.
Well, as an American, I have to say that, first of all, these lessons are incredibly important for us. I don't think that we're ready for the reality, and anybody in the United States that thinks that we can live in isolation, that we're a giant island in between two oceans, we can survive for very long living that way. I don't agree with that. I think it's a big mistake. And for our European partners, we've been with them since during the Second World War, during the First World War, Second World War. And I, as an American who served in Europe many, many years ago, I hope that we will never, ever end that alliance and that relationship with the Europeans. And in the European collective, that means Ukraine, which I again believe is probably the future leadership of Europe, based on the example that you've given all of us. So God bless you. Thank you. And Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Good.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.